John, thank you for being with us. You've spent a whole career in service of agriculture and nutrient reduction, it appears.
Yeah, I started off working with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, moved to a soil and water district, and then to the state in the Department of Natural Resources and their environmental protection agency. So that's my experience. And I've got a little background also in the stormwater area, but now I'm primarily speaking as a non-point source manager. So what I want to share about is something that Trevor Samples asked me to share, and that is a program that Ohio developed to address water quality. And I'll start just by giving a little background. Obviously, 1972 starts a lot in water quality, but in Ohio, that's also when the Great Lakes states formed a binational agreement, the other Great Lakes states as well. The US and Canada entered a binational agreement, and that was due to the algal blooms in the lake and all the water quality issues. At that time, the look, the taste, the smell of Lake Erie was very bad, and much of it was due to municipal sewage issues. And then by the mid 80s, at least half of that problem in Lake Erie, at least on our side of Lake Erie, had been resolved, that the phosphorus loading seemed to be going down to at least half of what it was in the 70s. And so that significantly improved in the 80s. And there were a lot of agricultural programs also addressing nutrients attached to sediments at that time. It didn't hurt when zebra mussels came along, that the clarity of Lake Erie also improved as a result. But by the 2000s, we were starting to see algal blooms again. And so lots of problems. I'll bring you up to 2010, when the lake that's the largest inland lake in Ohio, Grand Lake St. Mary's, ended up having its beaches closed due to harmful algal blooms. It was also the year that Ohio basically put together its first phosphorus task force report, basically saying what are the problems and how do we address them, focused more on the non-point source side. And then the legislature in Ohio also passed a bill in 2010 stating that if you had a watershed in distress, we basically created a designation that if you had a watershed in distress, you could apply other requirements to manure placement and the timing of putting manure out on fields because of that designation. And so the next year in January, the first designated water in distress was the watersheds draining to the Grand Lake St. Mary's. And so that's what we have in sort of in the background here. That was probably a welcome thing then, because nobody was doing much to really address in a wholehearted way some of the problems in this watershed. And so this really brought attention, because it has so many concentrated feeding operations there, how manure is being managed, that you basically couldn't place any manure between December 15th and March 1st without prior approval. You had to keep records of the volume of manure that you were storing. You had to ensure that you had storage for at least 120 days of manure. And then you couldn't put surface applications of manure on frozen ground or ground that was going to receive over an inch of snow. So it was the first element of any kind of regulation that affected some of these watersheds. Now, those watersheds could inject manure, but they couldn't surface apply. So let me keep moving in the timeline. So in 2013, there's more activity. Ohio Farm Bureau basically put together its own Healthy Waters Initiative. Ohio began working on its nutrient reduction strategy and produced its first nutrient reduction strategy, which was amended 2 years later with a few items that US EPA asked for, cystins or toxin levels in their water drinking system. These two photos are out of the New York Times from that period. So this was July and August of 2014. The Toledo's at the bottom of a large river system called the Maumee. And this basically had enough algal blooms and neurotoxins produced that they had to shut down the water system. And so on the day that the water system opened up again, you have this picture of the mayor drinking a glass of water from the system just to prove that it's safe again. So you knew it was pretty bad if the mayor has to demonstrate by taking the first drink. So let me keep moving forward. In 2016, I don't have this labeled, the state started a mass balance monitoring project where we would have pour points or designated places that had a gauge, and we would do continuous monitoring, or we would work with a university in the state to do continuous monitoring of nutrients at those sites. And so I believe we got about 60% of the state in those sites. And the Maumee is one of those big watersheds, the Scioto, the Sandusky. So these are some of the watersheds. And this would give us a picture of where we're at and where we need to be. So we started to see a picture of how bad the nutrients were in the state. And we also started to see more issues in watersheds because we started digging more on what were the contributing factors, not only where the cropping was, but the slopes, the ditch systems, and much of Northwest Ohio is improved drainage. It's a drainage system designed to move water out of the system, but along with moving water, it, of course, efficiently moves nutrients. So in 2018, our then Governor Kasich, who was on his way out, recognized the Lake Erie issues, and he issued an executive order recommending that 8 new watersheds in distress be added. And so this really has to do with going through the Soil and Water Conservation Commission and then going back to the legislature. And so that was a difficult political point. The agricultural community was not very happy with Governor Kasich and was a little concerned perhaps that this might be the start of more regulation in their industry. And so we had a new governor coming in, and he had already been running on a campaign that water quality was going to be a #1 issue. And the one thing that he had proposed was putting forth a 10-year program that would fund water quality practices and major changes in supporting both changes in agriculture, sanitary wastewater treatment, and other systems like home septic treatment systems. So that's what we're talking about today. So 2020 is really when the first sign up occurred, and they also formed an organization called the Oaci, the Ohio Agricultural Conservation Initiative. So this was a partnership between the agricultural commodity groups, environmental groups, and the research communities to begin to recognize what farmers were doing to establish improved water quality through best management practices. So they would do 2 things: create a farmer certification program, and then create a confidential farm practice assessment. So it was sort of a compromise between the government doing it and doing a public program, and the private entities taking it on and offering maybe some privacy for producers. So let me talk about what was offered in this program by the legislature the first year. So it wasn't a bond program. It was actually funded out of the General Revenue Fund. And the first year when it was established, it was to be up to $172 million. And they started, though, with this cut of the money, providing $30 million to our Department of Agriculture for best management practices. And they would provide $46 million to our Department of Natural Resources to support, maintain, create wetlands that would be strategic in treating nutrients or enhancing wetlands that could do more treatment than they're actually doing. So taking some systems that might be alongside a ditch and taking more of that water that was previously running by or through without any contact with the wetland and putting it through the wetland system. And then my own agency has the smallest cut, but it would support watershed planning and research and data collection, basically the monitoring side of things, and then some items that would be more infrastructure related. Where are the systems that are small, don't have the funding to fix them, addressing lead water systems that communities have complained about or concerned about after the Flint, Michigan scenario, and then also home septic treatment systems. So let's talk mostly about the agricultural affecting sides of this program. So the first step of this program involved the governor's office basically hiring a consulting group, the McKinsey group, to come in and make sure that this would be a cost-effective expenditure of money. And so the first thing that they did was look at all the practices, and they were going to develop cost curves. Basically, what practices get us the most gains for the least amount of money, and provide the most progress towards the goal. So we have two major watersheds in Ohio. You've got the southern coast, which is the Hypoxia Task Force area. It basically runs through the Ohio River and down to the Mississippi River and out to the Gulf of Mexico. And you've got the northern coast, the Lake Erie Basin. And so they both have goals that are applied to them. Ohio's Domestic Action Plan, which is our portion of the water quality agreement, or basically our document that shows how we're going to try to comply with the water quality agreement, specifies a 40% reduction in phosphorus. And then, of course, the Hypoxia Task Force goal is a 20% reduction by 2025 of nitrogen, of nutrients. So just looking at the graphic here, we take all the practices, what are all the options, and then we narrow them down to what we think are the prioritized range of options. Those practices that are gaining priority because they have a high impact, they reduce nutrients quite a bit, or there's a lot of potential perhaps for landowners to apply them. And then we reduce it even further just to simplify it and focus programs a little more down to 10 best management practices. And so these 10 practices were then focused on what kind of role they can have in reducing phosphorus to the Lake Erie Basin by 40%. We can sort of apply the same ideas to the Ohio River Basin as well. So here on one axis, you have the cost of phosphorus reduction, basically on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, you have, going towards your right, how much potential savings you get or reduction you get. So conservation crop rotation has a very wide bar. subsurface fertilization, variable rate fertilization, cover crops have a wide bar, edge of field buffers. Some people would argue about how much we can get out of this bar, but these are the ones that get us closer to the red line of reduction in their application. Some practices might be cheap for the pounds of phosphorus that they reduce, like two-stage ditch construction. We think we could get a lot of good out of putting water accessible floodplains alongside a traditional channelized ditch. But how much application can you get? And it's probably a little more narrowly focused at the headwater section, so there might not be as much area that you could apply it in. So these areas are also designated by kind of the area that they're speaking to: nutrient management versus erosion management, or reducing the movement of nutrients sort of at the field level, and then natural and physical barriers to water movement. And so in some cases, these might be actually looking at water retention in the fields. So these are the 10 practices. Let me show another graphic that shows the 10 practices and what we're focusing on, or what we've begun to focus on in 2020. So the first ones are really focused at farmers, their nutrient management plans, and their application of fertilizer. So the first 3, voluntary nutrient management plans. So obviously this has been going on for a while, but making it more of a condition and putting an incentive on having that plan and following it is happening through this H2O program. And then looking at variable rate fertilization, looking at the availability of equipment, if there's the potential of helping to buy down equipment in locations. And then manure incorporation, so that you would actually pay for a few years of incorporating manure, getting a producer used to a new way of doing business basically on the field. And that's the same idea as subsurface nutrient application, conservation crop application, and then cover crops. So, all these are really about how the farmer is working with his crops, and maybe trying to get back to some rotations that actually help nutrient losses. Now, the other 4 practices are more structural practices. They might be applied further downstream. As I said before, much of Western Lake Erie Basin, much of Ohio, in fact, is tiled. There are a few drainage systems, natural or otherwise, that haven't been affected by man. And if you go to that northwestern corner of the state, nearly every waterway has been channelized to some degree. And so the application of 2-stage construction makes a lot of sense in those watersheds. Drainage water management is focusing on the tile systems and incorporating stop logs and other management devices, basically to hold water in the field when we have the highest nutrient runoff that delivers it straight to the surface water. And then edge of field buffers, of course, and then wetlands. And in the wetland program, we're focusing first on the Department of Natural Resources actually taking a bigger stand, a little like Iowa is doing. Only our program, the first step was to find large wetlands that incorporated agricultural runoff through these areas and either enhance or develop them. So for these best management practices, we have a certain current application rate, and then what we think is the target application rate to fulfill what that cost curve was saying it could do for us. And so every one of these practices, estimates were developed for how much are people, for instance, doing soil testing and applying their nutrient management plan, or do they even have a nutrient management plan? Well, we think we can gain about 25% on what we have now in that part of the program. Variable rate fertilization, we think we can gain about 40% over time. Subsurface placement, we think we can gain about 19%, and so on. So each one of these has a certain amount that we have as a target application with the first few years of implementation. The way this program was rolled out, we've got 14 counties in the Maumee Basin that were the first recipients of H2O Ohio funding. And so because of COVID, funding was, signups were released last spring, but they got a little delayed. And we had over 1,000 producers, landowners come to meetings basically about that program and sign up for some of the first parts of it, which were management plans and variable rate fertilization, things like that, conservation cover crops and crop rotations. And then that sign up basically is covering over 1.1 million acres. So the next year, we're going to open it up to this 3, 4, 5 counties. We add about 5 counties, areas of 5 counties that are sometimes considered part of the Western Lake Erie Basin. They're a significant contributor to Lake Erie, though, through the Sandusky River system. And so the program is expanding basically from Western Lake Erie Basin to a bigger Western Lake Erie Basin area to the entire state in 2022. So this is how the goals were focused in the Department of Agriculture in the first year, that we would try to get 1 million acres in voluntary nutrient management plan development and implementation. We actually do follow up on the plan implementation, and there'd be a payment. And I'm sorry that I didn't include a slide on the amounts for the payments. And I don't have them readily available, so I can find that if anybody drops your email to me. But then overwintering cover crops, we had 400,000 acres going into that variable rate application, almost 500,000 acres set up as goals, and then you can see the other goals here. So let me shift gears now and talk about the wetland projects. So the wetland projects were primarily focused on the Western Lake Erie Basin, but not entirely. So we're not committed to just doing wetland projects in that part of the state. So ODNR has selected about 25 wetland projects, and many of these have already been completed for Ohio. So many of the ones in Western Lake Erie were underway at the, I guess, the beginning of June, and some have already been completed already. Some of them are large scale sites where they might have had a private, not a private, but a conservation group who already had a land holding or a land interest. And so by coupling their money and the state's water development wetland money, they basically went ahead and purchased the property and developed a large scale wetland. Just a few of the things that this has done. So this also establishes $3.3 million in actually doing some monitoring on these wetland projects. We're hoping to have 60,000 acres of watershed filtered by wetland projects over this 2-year period, and then 3,500 acres of wetlands created, restored, or enhanced. 26 projects in contract. That was at the time of this slide. So I guess there's one was missing. And then we had 28 million of $46 million allocated to the wetland side of the program, actually spent this last year to support those projects. So because of COVID, they got peeled back a little bit. Some of the ODNR money, Department of Natural Resources money, went back into the agricultural side because the sign-up was so big. And then we've got the number of threatened and endangered species that will benefit from those wetlands. So let me just tell you a few of the criteria that they were looking at when they selected projects. The first one was location. So what are the highest nutrient contributing watersheds in the Maumee and the Western Basin? They even looked amongst the sub-watersheds as to who was producing the most nutrient contribution and where potential sites were. What areas received the most agricultural drainage, obviously, and then what's a sizable wetland pool relative to the size of the watershed? So the bigger the pool area to the contributing watershed, that was also calculated. And then what are the other benefits that we can detail alongside of this? And so having long-term support from watershed groups, the Nature Conservancy, there's a Black Swamp Conservancy in Western Lake Erie Basin that has done a number of these wetlands, or having design, build, execution, just things that would make these happen faster. What co-benefits could we draw out of them? These were a number of the factors that we looked at. I'm going to shift now to my own agency side, which isn't as much focused on the non-point side. It's more focused on the infrastructure and the sanitary waste, the water system. So when the governor proposed this bill, he basically wanted it to help all people, that it wouldn't just be for agriculture, it wouldn't just be for urban people. And so he wanted to make sure that everybody could feel something good that benefited them coming from this program. And so our agency basically has supported a number of wastewater treatment projects, and they tend to be the size of the project where a community just doesn't have the funding to fix their wastewater treatment plant. They also are small enough that they don't hit the treatment goals that a large wastewater treatment plant has by the regulations. And so in Western Lake Erie Basin in Western Ohio, we've got three, actually this is all over the state, 3 projects that are being improved. We've got a number of lead service lines. These are water lines. Some of them go to schools that are being replaced and daycares. And then we have health districts that received $1.7 million to treat household septic systems. And then we're also upgrading our rain gauge system that goes along with our monitoring. This needed some vast improvement in the Western Lake Erie Basin. It was spaced out so widely that it was really hard to put the rain gauge data to our flow data. So all of Ohio, I don't know about your state, but our state has almost 1 million homes that are served by home septic sewage treatment systems. And so many of these systems are failing. They were put in years and years ago. Some may be directly discharging to streams. And so as these are found, we have a program that already existed that basically offers a low interest loan. Well, this basically offered grants to help people under a certain income level actually fix those projects. So this is a big support. So despite the pain, so originally the legislature said you can spend up to 172 million. And then the first year they were going to allocate about 89 million. And after after the first year, here's what we've invested: $67.7 million on nutrient reduction, wetlands restoration, infrastructure, monitoring, water technology. So it's not what we had planned, but of course we didn't plan to have a pandemic either. So everybody knows that story. There's another side to this that I just want to emphasize before I quit, and that is we're trying to increase the number of non-point implementation strategies over the state. So this is a map of all the watershed plans, those non-point source implementation strategies that address the impairment of a water body. And so these are like SMART goals for your watershed, right? SMART goal plans. And so we have a number of these in the Lake Erie Basin, but we've got far fewer in the Ohio River Basin. And so when the US EPA offered some assistance money, this is really where our money is going in Ohio. So this doesn't really show you where the plans are going to go. We prioritized the following watersheds because these were the more agricultural cropland producing areas in the Ohio River Basin. So the Upper Scioto watershed, the Great Miami watershed, Lower Great Miami, and Upper Little Miami, and Paint Creek that goes to the Scioto as well. These are areas where we know we have higher nutrient sources coming into the watershed. So that's one of the last things that I want to talk about is how these plans tie in. And so every plan basically addresses its target area in a watershed. What are your most critical areas that are producing the impairment that shows up in your watershed? And so for nutrients in the Western Lake Erie Basin, we took some modeling based on our mass balance monitoring and a little bit of modeling, and we produced a number for each watershed. Here's what it looks like your watershed is producing in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. And regarding the Western Lake Erie Basin, we had a phosphorus load, and what does it mean to reduce that load by 40%? And so that really is this column here, the third column or fourth column over, starting with estimated annual phosphorus load reduction. So this is really tied to the goals and the information that we're feeding each watershed as they do a plan. We give you an estimate of, based on your land use, the monitoring, what we think each acre of that land use produces, and what would it mean to reduce that by 20%? And then how does your practice that you're maybe planning for your watershed area reduce that? So that's where we want to be on our watershed planning side. And I'm going to summarize and just stop there. We think this is going to be a great program. It's a 10-year program, though, and it relies on the legislature coming back each year. And so far, because agriculture is concerned about not having regulations, we've got a broad party of people in support of this program. And that's not the only reason. They're in support of changing water quality as well, and needing some financial support behind it is important. And so we think despite COVID, we're still going to have this program progress into the next biennium. But time will tell how hard, I guess, the pandemic hits each state's economy. So that's where we're at. I hope that's helpful to you. I'm more of a program manager, so if you get too far in the weeds on some of the practices, I might not have answers for you, but can probably go find them. So.
Hey, John, we do have a couple of quick questions for you. If you can stop sharing, and Julie, if you pull up yours, we'll get to that here very shortly. Here's a good question for you, John. Do all the watersheds in distress only consider discharges from within the watershed? So are there outside sources of pollutants in the watersheds.
Yeah, they really do only consider the producers in that watershed. Yeah.
Why isn't it a mandated reduction in why isn't a mandated reduction in P application included in the P load reduction cost curve from McKinsey? Do you know?
Uh, well, it was included as a goal, a reduction goal. So in the cost curve, we basically had a long line, and we had a suite of practices working its way up to that 40%. So you could say, what do we need to get there? So I remember from Dave Wall's presentation, they've we've all got some other ways to try to get there, and I'm interested in comparing some of those ways and seeing what we can do to do that, because we're going to have to reevaluate every couple of years just to see if we're making progress. So it is in there, maybe not in the way that you're considering.
Do you have division or percentages of the P load coming from different sectors, cropping, livestock, et cetera?
Right. Well, it's primarily, yes, we do. It's primarily from cropland in the application of fertilizers or manure. So there are assumptions in there because we're not actually monitoring every HUC 12 watershed, so that makes it kind of difficult.
Thank you. We appreciate you taking the time with us today. And thanks for being here with us for the morning as well.
All right, thank you.